The army saw me before I reached the forest edge. I know this because they stopped moving the moment I cleared the first hill and became fully visible against the sky. One moment there was a forest in front of me. The next moment there was me stepping over its edge, not through it, over it, the way you step over a fence on a morning walk. The tree canopy reached my knee, and I stepped over the whole edge of it the way a person steps over a low fence on a morning walk. I had not thought about the trees. I should have. The outer edge of the forest lost approximately 40 meters of canopy in a clean straight line where my foot came down on the second step. That was an accident, and I felt bad about it immediately. The trees were not the enemy. The trees had been there significantly longer than anyone involved in this situation and deserved more consideration. But the army had stopped. That was what mattered in the immediate moment. A force that had been moving in organized formation toward the Red City had looked up and collectively decided to pause their schedule. I stopped too, looked down at them. They were closer now, and I could see the formation more clearly. Infantry in the front rows, heavy equipment further back, cavalry on the flanks positioned to move fast. Professional, organized, not a raid or a mob. Someone had planned this carefully, had moved logistics into place over days or weeks, had coordinated timing. This was not an impulsive decision. The scale comparison was something I was still adjusting to. Looking down at an army from this height was like looking at a detailed board game from above. I could see the whole thing at once in a way no general on the ground ever could. I counted roughly 10,000 people, maybe more, a significant force by the standards of whatever historical period I had landed in, pointed at a city that had stone walls and courage, but nothing remotely resembling a response to what they were currently looking up at. Nobody moved for what felt like a full minute. The army below had presumably never encountered this specific situation before. Their planning had not included a variable of this type. I understood. Neither had mine. Then something happened at the front of the formation. Movement. A group of riders separating from the main force, moving forward toward me at a pace that suggested urgency mixed with extreme personal uncertainty. I lowered myself to one knee, slowly, with all the careful deliberateness of someone handling something fragile in a small space. The ground still moved considerably, but the gesture read clearly, I think, as something less aggressive than standing at full height. The riders stopped at a distance they had calculated as safe, about 50 meters from the closest point of my knee, which put them at a height where I could see their faces reasonably well if I looked carefully. An officer, several guards, someone at the back with what appeared to be a flag I did not recognize from the Red City flags. Different colors, different design entirely. I raised one hand, palm out, the gesture I had used with Soren on the very first day. Universal, apparently, or at least universal enough to work here across that divide. At least in this world's version of universal, which meant everyone had learned the same lesson about the value of obvious signals. The officer below looked at the hand, then looked up at my face, then back at the hand, then said something to the person beside them in a tone that communicated this was not what the briefing had covered. I produced the greeting word Soren had corrected me on 4 days ago, carefully shaped, at a volume I had been working on for days. At a volume that I had been practicing for 4 days now, which still caused the horses at the front of the army to take several steps backward, but did not knock anyone over. Progress. Real progress. The officer did not fall. The officer's horse made a decision about leaving, but the officer prevented it with the practiced calm of someone who had spent years developing that particular reflex. What happened next, I did not fully understand. The officer spoke loudly in the direction of the army behind them. Whatever was said produced a visible ripple of response through the front ranks. Not retreat. Something more complicated than retreat and harder to read from above than the simple forward or backward movements I had learned to track. Confusion. Debate. The kind of collective recalibration that happened when the assumptions underlying a plan had been removed and replaced with something the plan had no framework for addressing. I used the word for stop, one of Soren's early vocabulary lessons. I said it at medium volume, which, from my perspective, was barely above a whisper. From their perspective, it was presumably a significant sound event. The officer looked back up at me, said something I could not fully pass yet, only catching fragments. A question. The word for name appeared in it, which I had learned on day 2. My name. They wanted my name. That was either the beginning of a conversation or the beginning of a record they intended to use in some kind of official complaint about property damage. Either way, it was a start. I said Kyle. One word, shaped carefully. The sound still moved the air more than intended. The officer's horse made a second opinion about its current location. The officer heard it, looked at their companion, repeated it back in a questioning tone that asked if they had heard correctly. The companion nodded. The officer looked back up at me, said something that included my name in it, which was the first time I had heard a person from this world say my actual name out loud, which was a strange moment. Small, but strange. I had been here 5 days. I had a name in this world now. The officer said something longer then, with a tone that carried weight. Not a threat. Not a greeting either. Something in between. The kind of formal speech that people used when they were representing something larger than themselves. I recognized the word for king, or the word that functioned as king in this language, which I had learned on day 3 when Soren had been explaining the city's structure. It appeared twice in what the officer said. I had limited vocabulary to work with, but I had enough to communicate one basic thing, which was the most important thing to communicate in this specific moment. I pointed back toward the red city behind me. Then I said the word for protect and pointed at the city behind me. The officer looked at the gesture and went very still, processing what the combination meant. I repeated it. Protect. Then pointed at myself, then back at the city. The basic sentence structure Soren had been drilling into me for 4 days. Subject, action, object, stripped down to its absolute minimum. I protect this city. That was what I was trying to say. Whether the grammar was correct was secondary to whether the meaning arrived. The officer looked at their companion again. An exchange happened. Rapid. Quiet. Then the officer looked back up at me and asked a question I mostly understood. Why? That was a harder question to answer with the vocabulary I had. I thought about it for a moment, then said the word for because, followed by the word for people, followed by the word for good. Inadequate. Grammatically wrong in at least 3 ways I could identify. But the officer seemed to understand something of it, because the body language shifted. Not relaxed, not yet, but shifted. Then from behind me, carried by the morning air from the direction of the city, I heard Soren's voice, small and distant from my height, but distinct. The old advisor had followed me, apparently, at whatever speed an elderly person on horseback could manage across field terrain. I looked back. Soren was perhaps 200 meters behind me, which from the army's perspective meant they were inside what should have been a very dangerous area, apparently unconcerned about that entirely. The officer below saw Soren too, said something at a different register, something that suggested recognition. Then Soren's voice came again, louder now, shaped to carry, speaking to the army rather than to me. I caught fragments of Soren's speech from above, my name in it. The word for peaceful, the word for agreement, repeated more than once for emphasis. Soren was negotiating something, or explaining something, using a credibility with this army that I did not yet have and could not establish in time. I held very still. The most useful thing I could do in that moment was not move, not speak. Let Soren's voice do the work that my limited vocabulary could not accomplish. The officer below listened carefully, looked up at me at intervals during the speech, then looked back at Soren, listening harder with each pass of the back and forth. The army behind them had stopped its collective murmuring and was listening too, in the way large groups of people listened when they were trying to decide something collectively. Several minutes passed. Soren finished speaking. There was a long silence from the army below, the kind that meant something was being processed rather than ignored. Then the officer raised their hand and made a gesture toward the army behind them. A slow, deliberate signal. The cavalry on the flanks began to settle. The formation relaxed from its marching posture to something looser. Not retreat, not advance. A pause that contained inside it the possibility of becoming something other than a battle. I exhaled, carefully. At this size, even an exhaled breath was a weather event in miniature, and the grass below me moved accordingly. Soren rode up close to the army officer, and a longer conversation began. I watched without understanding most of it. But I understood the structure. Soren was explaining me, making a case for what I was, or at least for what I was not. What I was not was an enemy, a demon, a weapon controlled by a hostile power, or an omen sent by a god who opposed this army's king. Those were the obvious concerns in order, and Soren appeared to be working through each one systematically with the patience of someone who had prepared this argument in advance. I was helpful, apparently, because the longer the conversation continued, the more the officer's posture communicated something moving from hostile through skeptical toward uncertain. Uncertain was significantly better than hostile, and I was counting every improvement in the available range carefully. Then a problem arrived. From the direction of the army's rear, movement. Different movement from the organized stillness the rest of the force had settled into. A rider coming fast, pushing through the ranks, urgent. The rider reached the officer and delivered something. A message, an object, I could not tell. But the officer's posture changed immediately, turned and looked back toward the army's rear, then looked up at me with an expression I could read even from this height. Something had changed, something that made the pause more complicated than it had been 30 seconds ago. Soren looked up at me, used the word for wait, which I recognized, then rode toward the back of the army formation, following the urgent rider's path back the way they had come. I waited. The army waited. The morning continued in the strange, suspended quality of a situation that had stopped moving and was not sure yet whether it was about to start again in a different direction. 15 minutes, 20. The sun had moved noticeably by the time Soren returned, and when the old advisor came back, the ride was faster than before. Something about the posture said urgency. Soren spoke to the officer, short, pointed. The officer responded, and Soren shook their head in a way that communicated clearly even from my altitude. Then Soren looked up at me and used several words I had not encountered yet in 4 days of lessons, followed by one I had, the word for danger, followed by south, followed by one I had, the word for danger, followed by the direction word for south, south. The army in front of me had stopped, but something was coming from the south. I stood up from my kneeling position. The army below braced as the ground moved, but held their positions, which represented a significant amount of trust or desperation or both. I turned and looked south. 3 of my steps, maybe 4, in that direction, past the open farmland, past a river that cut through the landscape in a silver line. The southern horizon had changed since this morning. A dust line, different from the eastern dust line, wider, denser, suggesting something larger in terms of scale or speed or both. Larger. The eastern army in front of me had perhaps 10,000 soldiers. What was raising dust to the south was bigger, significantly bigger, the kind of force that did not move quietly regardless of how organized it was. I looked back down at the Eastern Army's officer, used the best sentence I could construct with available vocabulary. The South. Big. Who? The officer looked up at me, said something to Soren. Soren looked up at me, and the old advisor's face said something that words had not arrived to convey yet. The Eastern Army was not the enemy. The Eastern Army was running from something else. The thing they were running from was what was raising dust to the south. And they had run into the territory of the Red City because it was the closest defensible location available. I processed that for a moment. The enemy of the city had been running from a bigger enemy, and that bigger enemy was now also the city's problem. And mine, apparently, given the geography and the direction I was currently facing. In my previous life, the most complicated situation I had personally navigated was a supply chain issue involving 3 countries and a customs dispute that had lasted 11 months. It had felt enormous at the time. Perspective was a strange thing to encounter so directly. I filed that observation away for later and focused on the immediate problem. Soren used the word for help again, then pointed south, then looked up at me with the expression of someone who had run out of other options and was now placing everything on a single variable. I looked south at the dust line moving toward us, looked north at the Red City behind me, looked at the army in the middle ground, waiting. looked at the army in front of me that had stopped fighting and was now looking at me with the collective expression of people whose threat assessment had just been replaced by a different and larger threat assessment. The Eastern Army's officer said something. Soren translated the part I could understand. The officer's army would not advance on the city, not with the southern force coming. They had no interest in fighting a battle on two fronts against an unknown variable the size of a geographical feature. What the officer was proposing, in the limited vocabulary available to me, was something between a ceasefire and an alliance, not permanent, immediate, for the purpose of addressing the larger problem currently moving toward all of us from the south at a pace that made waiting uncomfortable. I looked at the officer, a young person, I thought, younger than I had initially assumed, doing a job under conditions that the training had not covered. The composure was real, but the age behind it was visible. I said the word for yes, then the word for together, then the word for south. The most basic possible version of I agree, let us address this together, in that direction. Soren exhaled audibly. The old advisor then said something to the officer that produced a visible reaction through the entire front of the army formation, rippling backward like a wave through a crowd. They began to move, not toward the city, sideways, reorganizing their formation from an advanced posture to something different, something that put them on my flank rather than in my path. I waited until they had moved clear, then turned to face south. The dust was closer now, 30 minutes, maybe 40, before whatever was raising it would be visible. I had that time to prepare. Preparation, in practical terms, meant deciding what I was actually going to do when it arrived. I did not have weapons. I had not thought about weapons. A 100-meter person did not have an obvious need for weapons in the conventional sense, but that conclusion assumed the other side of the equation was a normal-scale problem. My hands were large enough to stop a formation. My feet could close a road by standing in it. My voice, which I had been carefully managing for volume, was itself a significant force when deployed without restraint. What I needed was information. What I had was limited vocabulary and 30 minutes and an advisor below who knew things I did not. I sat back down onto one knee and looked at Soren. Used the vocabulary I had to ask the question the situation required. What is in the south? Soren looked up at me for a long moment, then said a word I had not heard before, said it clearly, with the deliberate emphasis of someone making sure a significant piece of information survived the translation. I did not know the word. Soren saw that and used a different approach, pointed at me, then made a gesture that was clearly indicating size, moving hands apart to suggest something large, then pointed south. Not one of something large. Soren held up fingers deliberately. 1, 2, 3. 3 of whatever was raising that dust, in the same general size category as me. 3 things. The same size category as me, or similar enough that Soren was using the same gesture for it. 3 of whatever was raising that dust cloud to the south. I looked at the dust line again. It was measurably closer than it had been 2 minutes ago, which meant the gap between now and the moment of contact was shrinking faster than I wanted. Soren added one more word. I did not know it, but the tone it carried did not require translation. Whatever was coming, it had a name that people said carefully, if they said it at all. The Eastern Army's officer had drawn their cavalry in tight, close to the infantry. Not a fighting formation, a defensive one. Something about that specific posture said the officer knew what was coming and had already calculated the personal odds. I had arrived in this world 5 days ago with no preparation, no instructions, no special power granted by a benevolent system, and no plan beyond survival and learning basic vocabulary. I had a human brain in a body the size of a small mountain, and approximately 4 days of language lessons from a 73-year-old advisor who had decided this was the most important thing they would ever do. The dust to the south was significant and moving steadily, and whatever was at the center of it had a name, people said carefully. I had faced supply chain disasters, meetings that felt like war, and one microwave that had technically ended everything. None of that was useful preparation for this specific moment. This was different, but the same rule applied that had always applied in the previous life. When you did not have information, you gathered it. When you did not have capability, you built it. And when something large was coming towards something you had decided to protect, you stood up and faced it. The army below had not moved. They were watching me stand, watching the scale of that motion settle across the landscape, watching the dust rise from my footfall as I turned fully to face south. The officer had not run. That specific fact stayed with me. Every instinct said, run. Every piece of training said run, and the officer had stayed. I filed that away as something worth remembering about the Eastern Army's character. Not every group would have made that same choice under the same conditions. Soren had repositioned to a spot between the army and my left foot, which was either very brave or the result of someone who had spent so long planning this moment that the personal danger component had stopped registering. I looked down at Soren, used the word for how long, pointing south. How long until the southern force arrived? Soren held up fingers, then counted in a way that indicated hours rather than minutes. 2, maybe 3, depending on pace. That was more time than I had expected. Enough time to think. Thinking was something I was capable of doing, even if the vocabulary to act on the thinking was still limited. I had learned that in the previous life. The gap between understanding a problem and having the tools to address it was where most real decisions lived. The 3 things to the south, whatever they were large. Soren had communicated that clearly, and with the careful emphasis of someone who wanted the information to land properly. They were in a size category that put them in conversation with me rather than with the normal scale of the world around me. That meant the city's stone walls and the Eastern Army's organized infantry were not the relevant variable here. I was, which was a strange position for a former logistics coordinator to occupy, but the situation had not asked my preference before assigning it. I sat back down. Kneeling posture, which I had learned kept the ground movement lower and reduced the accidental damage radius significantly. From a kneeling position, I was still taller than anything in the surrounding landscape, but closer to the scale of conversation. The officer rode forward again, slowly, stopping at the now familiar distance. Said something to Soren that Soren then looked up and translated into the vocabulary I had. The question was, could I fight? I thought about that for a moment. In the previous life, I had never been in a fight. Not once. The most physical confrontation I had experienced was a disagreement over a parking space that had ended with both parties deciding it was not worth it. I had a body that weighed approximately what a small building weighed. My hands were large enough to cover an intersection. I could produce sounds that moved weather. Whether any of that counted as fighting in the sense the officer meant was a question I did not have enough vocabulary to explore fully. But the honest answer, assembled from available facts, was, I did not know yet. I told Soren the words for I will try. It was an inadequate answer to a serious question. It was also the most accurate answer I had available, so it was the one I gave. Soren translated. The officer was silent for a moment, then said something back in a tone that I identified as very close to the word for understood, though I was still learning the inflections that modified its meaning. The army began preparing. I watched the organized movement below me with the attention of someone who did not know the vocabulary of military preparation, but could read the purpose in the motion. Supplies being consolidated, equipment being checked, formations being repositioned from an advanced posture into something different. They were preparing efficiently under time pressure. They were getting ready for something they had not expected to face today, in a location they had not intended to be, alongside an entity their briefing had not covered. And they were doing it with the focused efficiency of people who had decided the situation required action regardless of how far outside the plan it fell. That efficiency was worth more than anything else I had observed about them so far. Not the weapons, not the numbers, the ability to adapt to conditions the plan had not anticipated. The hours passed in that compressed way, hours passed when something significant was approaching from a known direction. The dust to the south grew. The morning light became afternoon light. Soren spent the time in conversation with the Eastern Army's officer, a conversation I could see the gestures of, but not follow in detail. At one point, Soren rode back to me and spent 20 minutes giving me the fastest vocabulary lesson we had managed. new words said once with gestures, combat words, direction words, warning words. The vocabulary of what was about to happen rather than the vocabulary of introduction and greeting. I absorbed as much as I could. Context helped enormously. When Soren pointed at the southern horizon and said a new word 3 times in a row, I understood the word was for the things coming from there, and the tone attached to it told me the rest. The sun was 3 hours past midpoint when they appeared, not dust anymore. Shapes in the dust, moving, the movement of living things at speed, rather than the rhythm of a marching army. 3 shapes, large enough to see clearly from my standing height at this distance, which meant they were large enough to be in the conversation I had expected. Not human shapes, something else. I did not have the biology of this world memorized, and I hadn't encountered anything like them in the 5 days I had been present here. But large, moving fast, and coming in a direct line toward the city with the kind of purpose that didn't indicate casual travel. The Eastern Army saw them at almost the same moment I did, which I knew because the sound the formation made changed from waiting quiet to alert quiet, which were different things. The reaction rippled through the formation the way reaction moved through groups, not panic, but the tightening of something that had been prepared but was still encountering the reality of what it had prepared for. Soren looked up at me one final time before whatever was about to happen began. Used 3 words. The first 2 I knew. The third was new, but the context made the meaning arrive without translation. The first 2 words were, "You first." I stood to full height, turned to face south. The 3 shapes were close enough now that I could see detail. Large, yes. Moving on 4 points of contact with the ground rather than 2. Built for exactly this kind of movement across open terrain at speed, with the specific proportions of something that had evolved or been made to cover ground fast in the open. And they saw me standing there between them and the city. I know because they slowed, not stopped, slowed, which told me something important. They had not expected this variable. Their plan, whatever it was, had also not included me. That was the first small advantage. Surprise. Not mine. Theirs. I used it immediately. Took 1 step toward them. A single step, at my scale, covered ground that at their scale required a sprint. The gap between us shrank faster than they had been calculating. They stopped moving forward. I stopped the step I had been mid-stride in. We were both now still in the late afternoon light, with a field of distance between us. We looked at each other across the afternoon landscape. Behind me, an army that had been the day's original threat held its formation. Behind them, a city waited. Between us, the silence of 2 parties who had not expected to find each other here. I did not have a plan. I had a standing position and a direction, and the vocabulary lesson Soren had given me 2 hours ago. I used the word Soren had given me during the fast lesson 2 hours ago. The one said 3 times with emphasis while pointing at the horizon. I said it at full volume, which moved the air visibly across the distance. Said it at a volume I had not used since the first day, which produced a sound that crossed the distance between us at a scale they could not ignore. The 3 shapes went absolutely still. Not retreat, not advance. Still. And then, after a pause long enough that I had begun calculating what came next if silence was the only answer, one of them made a sound back. 3 things the same size as me just stopped, and one of them answered back. What do you think happens next? Do they fight or talk? Drop your prediction below. Part 3 coming. The sound it made was not language, not exactly. But it was not random noise either. There was structure inside it, the way there was structure inside a language you did not speak, but could still tell was a language. I had heard that distinction before, on the first day when Soren had spoken to me from below. I had not understood the words, but I had understood that words were being used. This was the same quality of sound at a different scale. The 3 shapes were approximately my height, maybe slightly smaller. The one that had spoken was the center one, which I took to mean something about hierarchy, or at minimum something about which of the 3 had decided to be first in this specific situation. I looked at them carefully. 5 days of this world, 0 prior experience with its biology, no reference material. What I had was observation, which had served me reasonably well so far. 4 contact points with the ground, not hooves, but something broader and heavier. Mass distributed lower in the hindquarters, heavier through the chest than proportion would normally suggest. The body mass was distributed differently from anything I recognized, lower to the ground in the hindquarters, heavier in the chest and shoulder region. The head was large relative to the body. Larger than proportion would suggest for an animal, which in my experience across 2 worlds usually indicated something was using the head for more than basic sensory input. Eyes forward-facing rather than to the sides. Forward-facing eyes, in the biological context I had grown up understanding, meant predator rather than prey. They were looking at me the way something looked at a problem it was actively working through, the specific, focused quality of a mind that had not reached its conclusion yet. The sound it had made continued for a moment, rising slightly at the end. A question. That was a grammatical structure. Questions rose at the end in the language I had been learning. The possibility that this was also true in a completely different communication system was either a universal truth about language or a very convenient coincidence. I was going to operate on the assumption of convenient coincidence for now and adjust the conclusion if the evidence required it. That was how I had handled most of the previous life. I had approximately 4 words available that were relevant to this moment. My name. The words for stop and wait. The word Soren had taught me that I had used first. The word Soren had given me in the fast lesson, the one I still did not have a full definition for, but which had produced the complete stillness in all 3 shapes when I used it. I used my name. Said it at the same controlled volume I had been practicing. Said it clearly, pointed at myself while saying it. The most basic possible self-introduction across any communication gap. The center shape was still for a moment after I said my name. Then it made a shorter sound back, 2 syllables, repeated once, directed at me with what felt like deliberate intent. It was pointing something toward me, not a hand. It did not have hands in the way I understood hands, but a directed gesture toward me. It was using my name, or something close to my name. The 2 syllables were not exact, but they were recognizably derived from what I had said. Something in that shape's communication system had grabbed the sound I had made and given it back to me in a form it could produce. That was a significant data point. Whatever these 3 were, they could imitate. They could take an input they had never encountered before and produce an approximating output within seconds. That level of real-time acoustic processing, taking a novel input and producing a functional approximation in seconds, was not simple and could not be dismissed as coincidence or reflex. I pointed at the center shape, waited, produced a questioning sound, not a word from Soren's lessons, just the rising tone structure I had identified as meaning question, directed at the thing in front of me. Your name. That was the question I was trying to ask. I had no vocabulary to ask it with, but the gesture and the intonation together contained the meaning I was trying to transmit. The center shape made a longer sound, several syllables, not rising at the end, a statement rather than a question. It was answering. Whether the answer was its name or something else was information I did not have yet, but it was answering. There was communication happening here across a gap I had assumed would require a year to bridge, if it could be bridged at all. The gap was not closed, but something was crossing it. I became aware that Soren had moved. The old advisor had ridden forward, carefully, to a position slightly to my right and further back, but close enough to observe this exchange. I heard the horse below me and glanced down briefly. Soren was writing. Of course, Soren was writing. Even in the middle of something completely unprecedented, the notebook had appeared. I found that genuinely reassuring, because it meant Soren expected the information to be useful later, which meant Soren expected there to be a later. I turned back to the center shape and tried something slightly more complicated, pointed at myself, said my name, then pointed at Soren below, said the word for advisor, which was one of the words I had learned on day 3 when Soren had been explaining the city's governance structure. Then I pointed at the city behind me and said the word for protect. 3 data points connected. Me, advisor, city I protect. It was a very compressed version of an introduction, but it contained the most relevant facts about who I was and what I was doing standing between them and their destination. The center shape was still for longer this time. Processing, I assumed. doing whatever the equivalent of processing was in whatever cognitive system it operated. The other two shapes had not moved since the first one spoke. They were holding a position that suggested waiting rather than readiness for action. Then, the center shape did something I had not expected. It sat down, lowered its considerable mass to the ground in a posture that removed it from the upright position and reduced its apparent size considerably. A deliberate and clearly intentional gesture. Making itself smaller in front of me was not the behavior of something preparing for an aggressive engagement. It was a communication. The other two followed, all three of them, sitting, below me, in a posture that read across whatever translation gap existed as something like, "We are not moving." I sat down too, mirrored the posture, made myself lower to their scale, or as close as I could get to lower, given the arithmetic of our size difference. For a moment, we were all sitting in a field in the afternoon light, me and three creatures from the south of a world I had arrived in less than a week ago. The Eastern army behind me had gone completely silent. Even the horses below me had stopped making noise, which was the clearest possible indication that the animals had assessed the situation and decided that stillness was the correct response. Soren's horse had not moved either. The old advisor had stopped writing and was watching. I produced the rising sound again. The question tone pointed south. Where had they come from? The center shape made a longer sound this time. A sequence. I could not follow it, but I could observe the shapes responding to it. The left one moved its head. Agreement, maybe, or attention. The right one stayed still. Then the center shape did something that changed my understanding of what I was dealing with entirely. It reached toward the ground beside it, picked up a stone, and drew a line in the dirt. Then another line, parallel. Then a gap. Then marks on one side and marks on the other side of the gap. Territory. A boundary. Two sides. It pointed to one side, then pointed south from where they had come, then pointed to the other side, then pointed toward the city behind me. The marks on its side were messier. The marks on the city side were fewer. It was showing me a map, a very rough map, drawn in dirt, of a conflict between two territories, and it had arrived on the city side of the boundary. I looked at the map, looked at the center shape, looked back at the map. The implication was assembling itself in my head with the slow certainty of something too obvious to be wrong. They had not been moving toward the city to attack it. They had been moving toward the city because the city was on the far side of something they were running from. The Eastern army had been running from the southern threat, but the southern shapes were also running, not toward us. Away from something further south that I had not seen yet, something that had been moving before this morning, started and had not stopped for any of them. Something that had pushed three creatures of my approximate size far enough north to collide with an army that had also been moving north for completely different reasons. Soren spoke from below me. I heard my name, and then several words, and then a pause, and then several more words. The tone was not alarmed. It was the tone of someone who had just understood something significant and was communicating it for the record. I looked down at Soren, who looked up at me and used the word for south one more time, then several words I had not learned, then one I had. The word for danger, then the word for danger, then a word I had not learned that was said with the specific care of a word that mattered more than the others around it. Then Soren pointed south, beyond the three shapes, beyond the dust they had raised in their approach, to the horizon, and said the word again. I looked south. The three shapes looked south at the same moment because they had heard whatever Soren had said, and it had produced the same response in them. The horizon to the south had changed while we had been sitting and drawing maps in the dirt. It was darker, not weather dark, not cloud dark, a different quality of darkness, the kind that did not move the way weather moved, but held a shape, held a defined edge, like something with boundaries was traveling north at a pace that made the earlier dust lines look slow. The center shape made a sound. Not a question this time, not a name. The kind of sound that did not require translation because the frequency and urgency of it communicated all the meaning across every gap. I stood up. The three shapes stood up at the same moment, all three of them, which was the fastest coordinated movement I had seen from them yet. they were already oriented south when they were fully upright. Everything in their posture said they had encountered whatever was coming before, and they understood what came with it, and had already formed an opinion about the personal odds. Behind me, I heard the Eastern Army moving, not retreat, a different kind of movement, the kind produced by orders being given quickly, Soren's voice carrying across the field with the volume of someone who had decided volume was necessary now. I looked back at the center shape, pointed at myself, pointed at them, then pointed south. Together. It looked at me for a moment, then looked at the other two shapes beside it, then looked back at me with the expression of something that had made a decision and was communicating it, then made the sound that I had been carrying in the back of my mind since the first time I had heard it, the sound that had produced the stillness, the sound Soren had given me. Said back to me by the thing I had arrived here prepared to face as a problem, said clearly and without hesitation, in a tone that carried certainty rather than question. Yes, 5 days in this world. I had arrived knowing no one, unable to speak, having destroyed a wheat field and frightened several hundred people. I had learned 30 words a day from an elderly advisor who had decided this was worth doing properly, through the specific patience of someone who planned ahead across long timelines. I had turned an advancing army into something closer to an allied position through a combination of patience and sitting down politely. And now I had formed an agreement with 3 large unknown entities to jointly address something further south that was larger than any of us, and that they had already tried to handle and had been running from, in 5 days, starting from zero. In my previous life, I had spent 11 months on a supply chain crisis. I had never resolved anything this significant before lunch. I turned south and the 3 shapes fell into position on my flanks, not behind me, beside me. The difference in that arrangement communicated something about how they understood the situation, an arrangement that communicated something about how they understood this situation that I did not have vocabulary to articulate yet, but recognized as important. Soren's voice came one more time from behind me. The old advisor was shouting now, which meant the situation had reached a point where volume was more important than form. 2 words I had learned. Then 2 I had not. Then the word for now. The darkness to the south had a shape. I could see it clearly from my height. Not 1 shape, not 3. Many, moving together with the organized consistency of something that didn't have individual decision-making at its center. A mass, a tide almost. The kind of movement that did not slow for obstacles but moved around them or through them and kept the same pace regardless. The center shape beside me made a short sound directed clearly at me. I looked at it. It looked back at me with the specific attention of something that had also been making assessments. In its forward-facing eyes, I saw the quality I recognized from every difficult situation I had ever watched someone choose to address anyway. In its eyes, forward-facing, problem-solving eyes, I saw something I recognized from the faces of every person who had ever been in a very difficult situation and had decided to address it anyway. Not calm, not fearless, present. The specific quality of a mind that had assessed the situation, had found the odds unfavorable, and had decided that unfavorable odds were not a reason to stop moving. I understood that quality very well. It had gotten me through 11 months of supply chain crisis. It had gotten me to this field, on this day, in this world I had not chosen to arrive in. I faced south. The tide was close enough now that I could hear it, a low, continuous sound that was not quite any single thing, but was the combination of many things moving together at speed with unified purpose. The 3 shapes beside me were braced and still, waiting for me to move first, which I understood from the way they had arranged themselves around me. This was the thing Soren had said, "You first." I had no weapons. I had no specific plan beyond stand here and prevent whatever was coming from reaching the city behind me, which was not a plan so much as a committed position. I had a human brain in a body the size of a small mountain and approximately 20 words that were relevant to combat situations, none of which covered what was currently approaching. But I had something the tide to the south did not have. I had arrived here by accident, without a plan, without preparation, without any of the things that were supposed to be required for a situation like this. I had built everything from nothing in 5 days. Whatever was coming from the south had been moving toward this destination before I existed as a variable. It had not planned for me. Its certainty about the outcome of this morning was based on a map of this field that did not have me in it. That gap between expectation and reality was the only resource I had that it did not. That gap between what it expected and what was actually standing here was the only advantage I had. I intended to use every part of it. The first contact happened before I was ready for it. That was the honest version of events. The tide reached the gap between us before the mental calculation of how to handle it had finished running. The lead edge of whatever was moving toward us resolved into individual shapes as they closed distance. Not 3 like my new allies. Many, dozens of shapes, each smaller than me individually, but moving together in a way that made individual size less relevant than the aggregate. I had seen pictures of swarms in the previous life and read enough about emergent behavior to understand what I was looking at here at this scale. Mathematical descriptions of emergent behavior in systems where individual units followed simple rules and the collective produced something more complex than any single unit was capable of. This felt like that. Each individual shape was making decisions. I could see that in the variation of movement within the overall pattern. But the pattern itself had a direction and a unified purpose that was not reducible to any single decision maker in the visible front. Something else was organizing this. Whatever was driving this was doing it from somewhere I could not see yet. The shapes in front were the visible edge of something larger behind them. I kept that thought at the front of my mind because it changed the tactical question significantly. Stopping the front edge was not the same as stopping the thing behind it. The 3 shapes beside me had spread out to my left and right by several meters, which increased the width of our collective blocking position considerably. They had done that without communication, or with communication I had not detected. Either way, it was the right movement. I used the word for stop at full volume, directed at the approaching tide, the kind of volume I had been careful to avoid since the first morning in this field. The front edge flinched, many of the shapes at the leading line stumbling or halting briefly before the motion of everything behind them pushed them forward again. Not a stop. A pause. The momentum of many things moving together was harder to interrupt than the momentum of one thing moving deliberately. Physics applied here the same as it had in every context I had ever encountered. The center shape beside me moved. I saw it from the corner of my field of view, a fast movement that covered ground at a speed I had not expected from something its size. It did not run toward the tide. It moved parallel to the tide's direction first, then angled inward, cutting to the side of the main front rather than directly into it. Flanking. Classic and correct. Strategy. Flanking. The same principle that made cavalry useful to armies at a scale I was currently too large to participate in at the army level, but very much participating in at the individual level. Don't meet the mass directly. Find the edge where the collective logic breaks down. I understood immediately. I did the opposite because the front needed occupying. I went straight into the front because if the flank was covered, the front needed to be occupied. Occupying it required something large enough that the tide had to address it rather than simply flow around it. My foot came down. The sound was significant. The shapes in the immediate impact area scattered outward, not fleeing, reorganizing around the obstacle I had just placed in their path. They were adaptive. They moved around rather than through. I moved again. Another step, another displacement, another scatter and reorganization. I was not hurting them significantly with the footfalls. What I was doing was disrupting the pattern of the movement, breaking the even momentum of something that relied on maintaining its aggregate shape. A swarm that could not maintain its shape was less than the sum of its parts. Disruption was the tactic, not destruction. Make the simple rules produce complex problems rather than simple solutions. The center shape came back into my field of view from the left, moving fast, and it had done something while I was not watching. The left portion of the tide had separated from the main body. Not by much, but the separation created an edge, and an edge was exactly the place where the simple collective rules broke down into individual decisions. Individual decisions were slower. The shapes at the separated edge were making individual decisions now, rather than collective ones. Individual decisions were slower. Individual decisions were less coordinated. The shapes at the edge were beginning to move in multiple directions rather than one. I planted my feet and made the loudest sound I had produced since the first morning. Not a word, not a greeting. A sound calibrated to carry maximum disruption across the maximum distance at a frequency I had learned in the past several days moved the air differently than other frequencies. The effect was larger than I had intended. The front third of the tide stopped moving entirely for several seconds. Not fear, not quite. Something more like sensory overload. A system that used sound as one of its coordination mechanisms encountering a sound it had no framework for integrating. Those seconds mattered significantly. The center shape used them. Its two companions used them. The coordinated movement they executed in those seconds was the most efficient thing I had witnessed in this world. The coordinated movement they executed in those seconds while the tide was reorganizing itself was the most efficient thing I had witnessed in 5 days in this world. I did not have words for what they did. I did not have concepts for most of it. But the outcome was visible. The tide's cohesion had been reduced by roughly a third. The separated portion was now moving independently, and independently moving pieces were not the same threat as a unified mass. The Eastern Army below, which I had almost forgotten about in the immediate focus of what was happening at this scale, had moved. I caught this in a moment between steps. They had advanced to a position that put them between the city and the scattered portion of the tide. Not attacking it, containing it, containing it. Someone in that army's command structure had understood what we were doing and had adapted their own tactical position to support it. That level of situational reading from a group that had not planned for this situation and had initially been the day's opposing force was something I was going to think about for a long time after today ended. Soren was still there. I saw the advisor at the edge of the chaos, in a position that was risky by most assessments of the situation, watching and writing, still writing. In the middle of everything that was happening at every scale simultaneously, someone was keeping a record of it. The center shape came to my side again, made a sound, short. I looked at it. It looked at the main body of the tide, still moving, still directed, and made a gesture I had not seen it use before, pointing, past the tide, to something beyond it that I had not been able to see yet because the tide itself was between me and whatever was driving it. I looked, over the tide, past it, to the south. Something was there that hadn't been visible before, something stationary, something large and deliberate about its position, occupying a fixed point while everything in front of it moved. It was not part of the tide. It was directing the tide. The thing directing the tide was not moving with it. It was watching, coordinating from behind. The shapes in front were the force, but they were not the decision. I looked at the center shape. It looked back at me, then looked past the tide, then looked at me again. The message had arrived completely without requiring any vocabulary we had built together. The front was a distraction. The source was behind it, and the source had not expected any of this to be as complicated as it had become. I stepped forward. I just stepped forward with 3 unknown creatures beside me against something even we might not be able to stop. Did I make the right call? Part 4 is the final part. Drop a comment if you want to see how this ends. Moving through the tide was different from what I had expected, and not because it was easier. It was different because of what the shapes in it were actually doing as I moved through them, because the shapes that made it up were making decisions as I moved through them, and the decisions they were making were not the decisions of something trying to destroy me. They were moving away from me, not fleeing, not routing, but adjusting, creating space, the way water moved around an obstacle in a current rather than pushing against it. The tide was not fighting me. The tide was not fighting me. It was flowing around me the way water moved around a stone in a current, continuing toward the city behind me without interrupting its own direction. That told me something important. The shapes in the tide were following a directive. The directive was the city, not me. I was an unexpected obstacle, but not the target. Whatever was directing this from behind had given a destination, and the shapes in front were moving toward that destination with the specific persistence of things operating on instruction rather than independent judgment, which meant the source behind the tide could change the directive. If I could reach the source, I could change what the tide was doing without having to address each individual shape in it one by one. The center shape had understood this before I did. It had been pointing past the tide the whole time, not at the tide itself. Past it, I moved, not carefully this time, not at the precise foot placement pace I had been using to minimize accidental damage, deliberately, at a speed that matched the urgency of the situation and accepted the collateral disruption as the cost of closing distance. The shapes of the tide scattered from my direct path as I moved, not all of them fast enough, and those that were not were moved rather than harmed. I noted that, with relief, harming things operating under direction rather than their own judgment felt wrong in a way I did not have vocabulary for, but understood without needing vocabulary. The three shapes were keeping pace with me on my flanks, not matching my stride exactly, but adjusting their own pattern to maintain the relative position we had settled into. Not matching my stride, their stride pattern was different, and their speed worked differently than mine, but they had adjusted to move at a pace that kept them in contact with my flanks. We were, in whatever improvised sense the word applied, a unit, something that had not existed 6 hours ago and would not have existed if the morning had unfolded the way any of the original plans had anticipated. The source became clearer as I closed distance, something that did not move the way the tide moved, that occupied its position with the specific stillness of something that had chosen to be there, something that had a different quality of presence, the way an organizing intelligence occupied space differently from the things it organized, larger than the tide shapes individually, not larger than me, roughly my own size range, which was its own category of information. The three shapes beside me were roughly my size. The source was roughly my size. Everyone in this conflict was operating at a scale that most of the world below me could only observe from a distance. I stopped when I was close enough to see it clearly and assess what I was looking at without the distance obscuring the details that mattered to the next decision. The tide flowed around me and continued moving behind me toward the city and toward the Eastern Army and toward Soren's notebook, all of which were problems I was going to have to address once this part was finished. The source was looking at me. Had been looking at me, I suspected, since before I had been able to see it clearly. The shape of its attention was different from the tide shapes, deliberate, assessing. The forward-facing eyes of something that made complex decisions rather than following simple rules, looking at me with the exact quality of attention I had seen in the center shape's eyes earlier. I had seen that quality twice today already, in the center shape beside me and in its two companions. I was looking at the same quality now, in the thing I had been approaching since Soren had pointed past the horizon. Not an enemy, or not necessarily, not the simple hostile force I had been framing this as since the dust appeared on the horizon. Something that had a plan, was executing the plan, had encountered something unexpected, and was now in the middle of a real-time recalculation. I recognized that state immediately and completely. I had been in it continuously since the morning I woke up in a field I had not chosen and started building responses from zero. I raised my hand, palm out. The gesture that had worked with Soren, with the Eastern Army officer, and with the center shape. The one that crossed every communication gap I had encountered so far in this world. The source looked at my hand, then looked at my face, then slowly raised its own corresponding limb. Not a hand, not the same anatomy, but the same gesture. Palm equivalent, facing me. It had seen me use this gesture before, which meant it had been watching long enough to learn what it communicated, which meant the observation had started well before today. That meant it had been watching since at least the first day, when I had used it with Soren below my knee. It had been present or informed for this entire sequence of events. Nothing that had happened today had been entirely a surprise to it. It had been present or informed for this entire sequence of events, which changed what I understood about its plan. The tide had not stopped moving. Behind me, the shapes were still directed toward the city, still following the directive. The source had not changed the directive when I appeared. It had continued the plan, while observing me. I needed to understand why the plan existed before I could address whether it should continue. I used the vocabulary I had, which was limited but present, pointed at the tide, pointed at the city behind me, used the word for stop and the word for why in close proximity, used the word for stop and the word for why together, which was grammatically wrong in Soren's language, but combined the relevant concepts in proximity. The source looked at the gestures, was still for a moment, then did what the center shape had done earlier, reached toward the ground and began marking in the dirt. A map again, more detailed this time. Territory, boundary, marks on each side, but different marks from the ones the center shape had drawn. More marks, more complexity. Something about how the marks were arranged, the depth and layering of them, suggested a history that was longer than anything a single day could contain. The marks on the south side were arranged in layers, not one group, multiple, and the deepest layer, the one furthest south, was drawn differently from the others. Heavier. The deepest layer, furthest south, was drawn differently from the others. Heavier. The kind of mark made by something drawing what it considered the most important information on the page. The source pointed at the deepest marks, then pointed at itself, then pointed at the marks in the middle layers, then made a gesture I read as moving, being pushed, then pointed at the northern marks, then at the city. It had been pushed north, multiple times, by something originating from the deep marks at the bottom of the map, something that had been moving consistently in one direction for a long time, something that had been pushing everything north, layer by layer, until the source and all the shapes with it had nowhere further to go except into the territory of the Red City. The Red City had resources. The Red City had walls. The Red City was the most defensible location available from the direction the source had been pushed from. The tide had not been an attack. It had been a migration under pressure, moving toward the most defensible available location, expressed in the only way available when you cannot speak. It had been a request for refuge, expressed in the only language available when your vocabulary does not overlap with the people you need to communicate with, and the thing pursuing you has not stopped moving. I looked at the map in the dirt, looked at the source, looked back at the map. Then I added a mark to the north of the city, where I had been standing when the day started. The source looked at my mark in the dirt for a long moment, then looked at me, then produced a sound with the rising quality I had learned to identify as a question directed at the person I was. I pointed at my mark, pointed at myself, then pointed south, past the source, at whatever had been doing the pushing from deep in that direction, then used the word for protect in the direction of the source. I protect. Not just the city. You too, if that is what the situation requires. The source was still for a long moment after the gesture combination arrived. Then it made a sound toward the tide. A different sound from anything I had heard it produce before. Not a directive sound, a stopping sound. The quality of something calling back a decision rather than issuing a new one. The tide slowed. The shapes that had been moving north toward the city began to lose their unified direction. Individual decision-making returning as the collective directive was withdrawn. They milled. They stopped. Some of them sat, the same way the three shapes beside me had sat when the center shape communicated non-aggression. Behind me, I heard the Eastern Army. Movement, but not attack movement. The kind of organized repositioning that happened when a threat stopped advancing and a commander was deciding what the new situation required. I heard Soren, the old advisor's voice carrying across the field in the way it had carried every morning for 6 days of vocabulary lessons. Words I mostly could not follow from this distance, but the tone I recognized. Soren was talking to the Eastern Army officer with the tone I recognized from 6 days of vocabulary lessons. Patient, organized, building the next bridge across the next gap. The source looked at me, then at the three shapes on my flanks who had been still throughout this exchange, said something to them. The center shape responded. Brief. Whatever was exchanged, the center shape's posture changed after it. Something had been confirmed that it had apparently suspected or known. Then the source looked back at me and asked a question. I recognized the structure, a question with my name in it and the word for why. Why was I here? Why was I doing this? The honest answer required more vocabulary than 6 days of lessons had built, and the vocabulary I did not have was the most important part of the answer. The honest answer was that I had arrived by accident, had been building responses since the first morning, and had found one consistent principle across 6 days. The city treated me with patience instead of fear. That was worth protecting. I did not have words for any of that. I did not have those words. I had 20 days of basic vocabulary and Soren's careful drilling on the most useful structures, so I used what I had. The word for accident, the word for here, the word for I will stay, then the word for because, and then the word for people, and then the gesture toward the city. Inadequate, incomplete, missing most of the actual meaning. The source looked at the gestures and the words and was still for a moment, then did something I had not expected from anything I had encountered today. It made a sound I identified as a laugh, with enough confidence to act on the identification. Not a threat sound, not an alarm sound, but the quality of something that had found something genuinely funny, the quality of something that had just encountered something unexpected and found it genuinely interesting rather than dangerous. Not a threat, not an alarm. The specific quality of sound that came from a living thing that had encountered something unexpected and found it genuinely interesting. Then it used my name. The approximation it had heard when the center shape had relayed it, said it in the rising tone of a question, followed by a statement that I caught fragments of. I did not get all of it, but enough arrived. Accident was a word it understood, and something about its use of my name suggested that arriving by accident and choosing to stay was not familiar to it. Accident was a word it understood, and something about how it used my name suggested that arriving by accident and choosing to stay anyway was not a concept it had encountered from the northern side of the border before. The thing that had been pushing everything north for what the map in the dirt suggested was a very long time was still somewhere in the deep south. That had not changed. The tide shapes around us had stopped moving toward the city, but they hadn't gone anywhere. The Eastern Army was repositioned but not dispersed. Soren was still writing. The situation had been complicated by communication into something that was not a battle anymore, but was not resolved either. I looked at the source, pointed south, pointed at the deep marks in the dirt map, then used the word Soren had given me in the fast lesson before the tide arrived. The word that had produced stillness when I used it. I said it now as a question rather than a statement. The rising tone I had been using all day whenever I needed to ask rather than declare, directed at the source and the deep marks in the dirt. The source looked at the deep marks, was still for a long moment, then pointed at itself, at the 3 shapes on my flanks, at the tide shapes now sitting in the field around us, then pointed south at the deep marks. Then it looked at me. The question it was asking back was the same one I had just asked it, the same structure, the same gesture, the same rising tone. Together? I thought about everything that had happened since I woke up in a field 6 days ago and destroyed a wheat field belonging to a farmer I still owed an apology to. I had learned 30 words a day. I had sat in a field for 4 days becoming legible. I had turned an advancing army into something closer to a ceasefire through patience and the willingness to sit down first. I had negotiated with 3 unknown creatures in 30 minutes through maps drawn in dirt and a rising vocal tone. I was still adding things up from 0, but the pile was growing. I pointed south, then at the source, then at myself, then at the 3 shapes beside me, then at the distant city and the distant army, then south again, all of us, together, that direction, that problem. The source looked at each thing I had pointed at in sequence, then it made a sound toward the tide shapes. The tide shapes began to move, but differently, not north, south, east, west, organizing into something that had a structure I recognized from watching the Eastern Army earlier today. A formation. Not a flowing tide, a deliberate formation, shapes taking positions that made sense relative to each other, with spacing and orientation that suggested something had thought about this before. The 3 shapes on my flanks began to move too, taking positions in the emerging structure that had clearly been considered. I stood at the center of it, 100-meter figure in a medieval field. The formation had not existed an hour ago. It had been assembled from components that were pointed at each other as problems an hour ago and was now oriented south as a single unit. Below me and behind me, Soren had stopped riding. The old advisor was watching. I looked down at Soren. The distance was still what it had always been, but 6 days of vocabulary lessons had built something across it. I used the best sentence I could assemble from everything I had learned. The words for "I will come back." Then the word for "after." Then the word for "finished." Soren looked up at me, said something back that I caught almost completely. The word for "I know." Then the word for "go." I turned south. The formation around me oriented at the same moment. The thing that had been pushing everything north for a very long time was still there, somewhere past the southern horizon, still moving, still unaware, I hoped, that the field in front of it had just been reorganized from collision course into something it had not accounted for in its planning. I had arrived in this world with nothing. No plan, no preparation, no chosen hero status, no glowing interface, no special ability beyond a very large body, and 28 years of habits built around paying attention. The walk south took longer than I expected, not because of the distance, because of what was happening around me as I moved. The formation that had assembled itself around me in the field was not static. It adapted continuously as we moved, reshaping itself to the terrain ahead without any visible communication driving the changes. The shapes that had been part of the tide reorganized themselves into positions that made sense for moving terrain rather than holding ground. The 3 shapes on my original flanks shifted their positions relative to me based on the landscape ahead. I watched that adaptation and tried to understand the decision-making behind it. Someone in this formation was thinking about approach angles, about what terrain did to a moving group, about how to maintain cohesion while covering ground efficiently. The source was doing that organizing, holding the whole picture while managing the individual parts from a position at the formation's center where it could see everything. Not at the front where it would be first contact, not at the rear where it would be last, but at the center where it could see the whole formation and make adjustments based on what was coming. That kind of thinking was not simple. It required holding a model of the whole while adjusting the parts, which was the same skill that had gotten me through 11 months of supply chain work. It required the ability to hold a plan and adjust it simultaneously, which was the same skill that had gotten me through 11 months of supply chain crisis management. I had a thought that felt strange to have in this context, which was, this is someone I could work with. Not today, necessarily, not in this specific situation that was still moving and had not resolved. But eventually, the quality of thinking I was observing was compatible with the quality of thinking I was trying to produce. The deep south, the thing on the map marked with heavier lines. We were moving toward it. The tide shapes around me, the 3 shapes beside me, the source at the formation's center. All of them had been pushed from that direction. All of them had been moving away from it until they ran out of north to move to. And now we were going back, together, toward the thing that had been pushing. I thought about why that mattered, not the tactical question of whether we could address it, which was unknown. The question of what it meant that everything I had encountered in this world since the first morning was downstream of this one source. Soren's city existed where it did because of geography and history and decisions made by people before Soren was born. The Eastern Army had been moving north because something had displaced them from their original territory. The tide shapes and their source had been pushed from further south by the same consistent pressure. Everything in this part of the world was reacting to one thing that had not stopped moving north. Understanding a problem completely was not the same as being able to solve it, but understanding it was the first step, and I had been building toward understanding since I woke up in a field with a river on my palm and a crater where my first step had been. The horizon changed, not the darkness of the tide, not the dust of a moving army. Something different, a stillness at the southern horizon that had the quality of something occupying space rather than moving through it. The source made a sound from its position in the formation's center. The shapes around me slowed in response, not stopped, but shifted to a pace that allowed time for assessment before continuing. Not stopped. Slowed the way a group slowed when something important was coming into view, and the person responsible for decisions wanted time to see it clearly before continuing. I slowed with them, looked south. Let my eyes do the work they were capable of at this height, which was considerably more range than anyone at ground level could access. What I saw at the southern horizon was large, larger than the source, larger than me, in the specific way of something that had been accumulating size over time, rather than being built to a fixed design. Not vastly larger, not a different order of magnitude, but larger in the specific way of something that had spent a long time accumulating, rather than something built to a design. It was not moving. It was waiting. The difference between something moving toward you and something waiting for you to come to it was significant in ways that went beyond the obvious tactical question. Something that waited had patience. Something that had patience had been operating on a long timeline. The map in the dirt had shown multiple layers of pushed territory, multiple cycles of displacement. That was not one season's work or one campaign's damage. That was generations of consistent, patient, directional pressure applied in one direction over a very long time. I was looking at something very old, something that had been doing this since before the city behind me had walls, probably since before the people in it had the specific language Soren had been teaching me. The source moved up beside me, made a sound, quieter than any of its previous sounds, directed at me specifically, pointed at what we were both looking at, then pointed at itself and made a gesture I had seen used before to indicate duration. A long time, longer than anything I had reference for from 6 days in this world. A long time. Yes, I understood. Long before you. Longer than any of us. This thing at the horizon had been there longer than any of the things it had been pushing. I pointed at myself, then pointed at the horizon, then used the word Soren had drilled into me on the 3rd day when we had been working through useful structures. The word for new. New. I am new here. This thing at the horizon does not know about me yet. The source looked at the gesture, was still for a moment, then made a sound that rose at the end, a question, then pointed at me. You, then the horizon, then the gesture for new again. You are new to it. It does not have you in any of its accumulated experience of this territory and these encounters. Yes, I arrived 6 days ago. I have no history with it. I carry no record of previous encounters, no weight of previous losses, no accumulated fear from watching it push everything north for generations. I was, from the perspective of the thing at the horizon, an unknown variable. The same advantage I had used with the tide this morning, but larger. The source made a sound toward the formation. Something shifted in how the shapes around us were positioned. Then the source looked at me and made a gesture I had not seen before, but understood immediately in context. You go first. The same structure Soren had used at the start of this day, and I understood why it kept being the right answer. The new variable went first, because the other side had not planned for it. The principle that had opened every significant exchange today had been the same one. The new variable goes first, because the new variable is the thing the other side has not prepared for. I had arrived in this world by accident. I had built everything from nothing in 6 days. I had no weapons, no plan, no special ability beyond size, and the habits of a person who had spent a previous life paying attention. But I was new to all of it, and new, in a situation defined entirely by the weight of established patterns and long history, was the most disruptive variable available. I stepped forward, alone this time, ahead of the formation, the way I had stepped towards Soren's camp on the first morning. One step that covered ground at a scale the thing at the horizon would have to notice. It noticed. I could tell because something in how it occupied its space changed. Not movement, an orientation. The quality of attention shifting from the general to the specific. It was looking at me. I raised my hand, palm out. The gesture that had worked every time, across every gap, in every exchange today. The thing at the southern horizon was still for a long moment. Long enough that I began calculating what came next, if stillness was the only response. Then slowly, It raised something back in my direction. I did not know what came next. I did not have a script for this, did not have a plan beyond the gesture I had just made and the 6 days of vocabulary behind it and the formation waiting at my back. But I had learned something in 6 days that I had been learning without knowing it in the 28 years before. You did not need to know what came next. You needed to show up, pay attention, and be willing to respond to what actually happened rather than what you had planned for. The rest followed from that. It always had. I had a formation beside me now. I had an advisor below who was keeping records. I had a city that had spent 4 days correcting my vocabulary instead of running. I had an Eastern army that had read the situation and adapted its position to support something its briefing had not covered. I had Soren still writing, still building bridges across every gap. The pile from 0 had become, in 6 days, something I did not have a word for yet. I took 1 step south. The ground moved. The formation moved with me. Above us, the sky was still the same sky I had looked at from the first morning, the one that was below me when I woke up, the one with the different stars at night. Still new, still not fully mapped, but mine now. In whatever limited sense a world became yours when you chose to stay in it after arriving by accident. I kept walking. That's the complete story of how a guy who died arguing with a microwave became the shield of an entire world. If you want to see more, a new arc, a new world, a new reincarnation, drop a comment. Every view and comment tells me to keep going.